On the 20th of November 1945, a series of trials designed to draw a line under the horrors of World War II began in the German city of Nuremberg. The legal proceedings that began that day, known as the Nuremberg Trials, included charges against 199 separate people accused of having a role in the conflict and the Holocaust. But while 199 may sound like an impressive roundup of some of the most despicable humans around, it barely scratched the surface of those facing charges that included genocide, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. There were numerous high-profile absentees. Some of the biggest names had already escaped through suicide, while others had simply vanished. But over the coming years, thousands of Nazis managed to successfully evade capture and flee abroad, mostly to South America, along carefully constructed escape routes known as the Ratlines. The story of the Ratlines isn't always an easy one to tell. Firstly, a lot of the information isn't exactly clear and often includes plenty of hearsay and vague rumors that would almost certainly not stand up in court. But the second reason is altogether darker. The Second World War was a period when right and wrong, good and evil could be conveniently separated. But those cozy boundaries began to blur as the conflict drew to a close. The true scope of the Ratlines has never fully been revealed, but rumors and at times outright facts have implicated the Catholic Church, allied secret services, and communities in Germany, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Belgium, and across South America. It's easy to assume that anything relating to the Nazis would have been vehemently opposed, especially after the extent of the final solution was uncovered, but unfortunately, that just wasn't the case. In the years after World War II, thousands of war criminals escaped justice, at times helped by the very people you would have bet your house would never have helped the Nazis. The 7th of May 1945 may have brought the final surrender of Nazi Germany, but for many who were accomplices to some of the most heinous crimes ever perpetrated, the story was far from over. It can be tempting to begin this story during the final stages of the most destructive and hellish conflict that the world has ever seen, but the wheels were set in motion long before then. To really get an idea of how it all started, we have to begin with a relationship that from the outset might appear polarized, but was far from it: fascism and the Catholic Church. It's important to begin by saying that not all fascist countries shared the same relationship with the Church. In Germany, the grand uber-fascist of them all, the link was considered fairly weak, though certainly still present. But in Spain, Italy, and even Vichy France, the link between the far right and the Church at times ran deep. Really deep. If that sounds like a complete oxymoron considering the terrible events that happened under the banner of fascism during the 20th century, then you're probably right. But you also need to only look at the Crusades and the Inquisition to see just how nasty religious extremism can get. The Church didn't support genocide and mass murder, but was often quietly and, well, sometimes loudly supportive of regimes that aimed to preserve a more conservative and religious way of life. During the Spanish Civil War, the left had been responsible for attacks on churches, priests, and nuns in an attempt to establish a more left-leaning establishment free from the rigid and traditional hierarchy that had typically placed the church at its core. The Church often feared the rise of communism far more than fascism, and while it would be difficult to imagine priests and bishops openly supporting the actions of the Nazis, it was clear they were often willing to turn a blind eye if it meant preserving the Church's power. But I also want to caveat this section by saying that this was certainly not a blanket approach. Throughout World War II, there were countless stories of members of the Catholic Church providing heroic support for those persecuted by fascism, many of whom lost their lives as a result. This is one reason why this is a topic that's become so contentious, because while many stood valiantly against the fascists in their attempts to exterminate the Jewish people, others had absolutely no qualms in aiding those responsible for mass murder. The first of what we could call Ratlines were not set up to allow war criminals to escape Europe, but rather to facilitate Catholic immigration to South America and in particular Argentina. This early line passed through Spain and then Portugal, where ships departed for South America. But to even call this a formal line at this point would have been a stretch. If anything, it was simply a fairly innocent and rudimentary plan to facilitate immigration overseas. But this is the first time we see the presence of the Vatican, and it was said to be Monsignor Luigi Maglione, Vatican's Secretary of State, who instigated the idea in 1942. It's not immediately clear why this was set up. Perhaps the Church could see the writing on the wall already and feared the repercussions in Europe if the Allies succeeded. Up until 1942, the Nazi war machine had been unstoppable, and while the year marked the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad, which would eventually shatter the aura of invincibility around the German Wehrmacht, its calamitous end wouldn't come until 1943. Whatever the reasons behind setting up this early route to South America, it's important to stress that it does appear to have been established with honest intentions in mind. But as we'll come to shortly, that honesty didn't last very long. Readership says a lot about an author, and with Adolf Hitler said to be very much impressed by Catholic Bishop Alois Hudal's book, The Foundations of National Socialism, you immediately get a sense of what kind of crowd he was performing for. Once held in high regard within the Vatican, Hudal fell out with the Church in spectacular fashion after the publication in 1937, which not only praised the Nazis, but also openly questioned Vatican policies. A firm anti-communist, anti-liberal, and very much pro-far right, Hudal would go on to become one of the first key orchestrators of the Ratlines. In 1944, Hudal held a role as a rector in a seminary for Austrian and German priests in Rome. By June, Allied armies had overpowered German defenders and taken the Eternal City, though it would almost be another year until the rest of the country was free. With the war effectively over for thousands of German-speaking POWs in Italy, Hudal took it upon himself to assist their situation in any way he could. In the early stages, this mainly involved counseling, passing on messages to family members, and generally ensuring their safety while in captivity, or as he put it, a charity to people in dire need for persons without any guilt who are to be made scapegoats for the failures of an evil system. But this soon spawned into something far more devious indeed. By providing fake identity papers along with a papal guarantee that meant checks never took place because surely a bishop wouldn't lie, right? Countless war criminals were able to escape to South America thanks to the work of Alois Hudal. And there were truly some big hitters on his list, most notably SS Captain Eduard Roschmann, Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, Gustav Wagner, SS Sergeant at Sobibor, Alois Brunner, the man in charge of the deportations from France and Slovakia to German concentration camps, and lastly, Adolf Eichmann. And just a quick point on that last name, we've already done an entire video on the quite extraordinary pursuit of Eichmann by the Israeli Secret Service over on our sister channel Mega Project, so if that spikes your interest, well, why not check it out afterwards? Sometimes these men had been caught in Allied roundups, but with so many suspects taken into custody and their true identities carefully hidden, many managed to escape or are allowed to leave legally thanks to the work of Hudal. Others found themselves on the run, but sought out Hudal specifically to help their cause. This went on for years, right under the noses of the Allies in Western Europe. A letter dated from the 31st of August 1948 from Bishop Hudal to Argentinian President Juan Perón asked for 5,000 visas for 3,000 German and 2,000 Austrian soldiers. As if just to clarify, Hudal added that these men weren't Nazi criminals, but rather honest anti-communist fighters who had saved Europe from Soviet domination and now deserved the chance to start a new life. Of course, there are layers of what can only be called utter bullshit there. There's no doubt that Hudal thought he was doing the right thing, but you need only briefly to read about the actions of Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz to know that if anybody deserved to be on the front row at the Nuremberg trials, it was this sadistic monster. Then there's the absurd claim that the Nazis had in fact saved Europe from Soviet domination. Last I checked, in 1948, the Soviet Union held sway of almost half of Europe, while the Nazi dream lay in a smoldering wreck. Hudal died of natural causes aged 77 in 1963 and was never charged with aiding and abetting the escape of thousands of Nazis. Now, before we really get into the bulk of the escapees, there's the question of why exactly South America became the Nazi go-to location. And we can only really begin with one man. If you've ever seen Madonna's 1996 film Evita, which tells the rags to riches story of Argentine heroine Eva Perón, you might be forgiven for thinking that her eventual husband, President Juan Perón, was quite an upstanding man who fought for his people, especially the working class. We don't have anywhere near enough time to go through the complexities of this particular idol worshipping, but let's just say that Juan Perón may have been on Hitler's Christmas card list. Perón didn't hold back with his disgust regarding the Nuremberg trials and almost immediately authorized the Ratlines and visas to be given to those looking to escape Europe. Perón, and the ideology that emanated from him and his wife, known as Peronism, is littered with contradictions, which makes nailing down the reasons behind the Ratlines especially difficult. Imagine if the far right and the far left had an illegitimate love child and named him Juan, who supported both nationalism and unionism, who ruled with an authoritarian grip but was also wildly popular with the poor. Well, then you might be getting on the right track. To make things even more complicated, Argentina received more Jewish refugees than any other country in Latin America in the period around World War II. This allows it to make the rather bizarre claim that it was a safe haven for both a huge number of Nazi war criminals and also Jewish refugees. One possible explanation could well have been financial, with rumors of stolen Nazi loot miraculously finding its way across the Atlantic. An investigation was launched shortly after the war which looked into two Argentine banks, in particular Banco Germanico and Banco Tonquis, but surprise, surprise, a presidential decree in 1946 halted the case before investigators could get too close. But Argentina was certainly not the only South American nation to enthusiastically welcome fleeing Nazis. Estimates by German prosecutors have stated that Brazil took in between 1,500 and 2,000 Nazis, Chile between 500 and 1,000, while Argentina trumped all of them with roughly 5,000. Of course, these numbers are impossible to corroborate, and some believe them to be conservative, to say the least. If Hundar's early work had blazed a trail for escaping Nazis, the San Girolamo Ratline and the work of Roman Catholic priest Krunoslav Draganovich took things up a notch, and here's where the story becomes very murky indeed. Draganovich may have ostensibly been a man of the church, but as a lieutenant colonel of the Ustashi, a Croatian fascist and ultra-nationalist organization responsible for hundreds of thousands of Serb, Jewish, and Roma deaths, he also had his fair share of blood on his hands. When Perón finally authorized the Ratlines into Argentina, it was Draganovich who played a fundamental role from the San Girolamo degli Irelizzi Seminary College in Rome. But this was certainly not a one-man show and encompassed a wide-ranging network stretching across Europe. With war criminals often hiding in either Germany or Austria, word would be quietly passed to them that they could be safely transferred out of Europe. They would then be brought across the border into Italy and housed secretly until a berth on a ship along with the required documents could be procured. Often these Nazis would stay in religious buildings along the way, or with those sympathetic to the cause, which significantly widened the numbers of those in the know. Once in Italy, those assisting them would apply for a displaced person passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which in turn would lead to a visa for a specific South American country. With both of these in place, there was the relatively simple act of reserving a berth on a ship and departing from Genoa. And just like that, the most sought-after war criminals in the world were able to slip through the net with relative ease. The most famous names to pass along this particular rat line were the sadistic freak Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, and the Ustashi founder and the head of the independent state of Croatia, Ante Pavelic. If the name Klaus Barbie sounds familiar, it really should, because he was extreme even by Nazi standards. While stationed in Lyon as head of the local Gestapo, he personally tortured thousands of people, and estimates place the number of those killed at the hands of Barbie alone as high as 14,000. He was a monster of monstrous proportions, and again, the kind of person that it's difficult to comprehend how anybody could have justified his escape. And sadly, that's not the end of Klaus Barbie in our story, as we'll get to in just a moment. Ante Pavelic was both a politician and a man whose direct actions led to hundreds of thousands of deaths during what has been called the single most disastrous episode in Yugoslav history. And considering what happened in the 1990s, that is really saying something. After the collapse of the Ustashi, he fled to Austria before finding his way into Italy in 1946, disguised as a Peruvian priest. There he was sheltered in a series of safe houses for 2 years before departing for Argentina in 1948 with a Hungarian Red Cross passport under the name Pablo Arañas. There he lived in relative peace for almost a decade until 1957, when he was shot several times in a failed assassination attempt by a Serbian Blagoje Jarkovic. In the coming days, as he recovered in hospital, his true identity emerged, and 2 weeks after the shooting, the new Argentine government agreed to Yugoslavia's extradition request. But this wily mass murderer wasn't done yet. With a bullet still lodged in his spine, he fled the hospital and eventually gained asylum in Spain, the only country in Europe where fascism had triumphed, and one which was apparently more than happy to accommodate war criminals. Good news though, he died a year later from his injuries. Now, here is the point in the video where things get even more uncomfortable. I said at the start of this video that for the most part, World War II was easy enough to divide into good versus evil, or at least it seems like it. But after the conclusion of the war, a new issue entered the fray that blew this convenient black and white picture completely apart. Communism. In what is perhaps the most shocking example of short memories being massaged for present gains, the US, Britain, France, and the West German intelligence agency began courting Nazis almost immediately after the war in an attempt to gain an upper hand over the Soviets. And speaking of shocking examples, can you guess which psychopathic Nazi torturer inexplicably came to work for the Allies? Yep, that would be Klaus Barbie himself. In 1947, he was recruited by the US Army Counterintelligence Corps to help with anti-communist efforts in Europe. When the French discovered he was not only still alive, but being sheltered by the Americans, they formally requested he be handed over. The US refused, and he conveniently found his way to Bolivia soon after, where he continued working for the Americans. In 1983, he was finally extradited to France, and the US made a formal apology to the French people. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987 and died of cancer in 1991. It's not often that we say this, but well, good riddance, you dickhead. Then we have all of the scientists and engineers involved in Operation Paperclip, in which the US harvested the best and brightest Nazi minds at the time to go and work in the United States. These individuals were sometimes smuggled out through the San Girolamo Ratline, with Dragonovich said to take care of the majority of the logistics, presumably in return for the Allies turning a blind eye to the legions of Nazis sailing across the Atlantic to start new lives. And it wasn't just the Americans doing it. The British did exactly the same with their rather brutish-sounding military unit known as T-Force. With that name, it's perhaps not entirely surprising that T-Force didn't exactly apply a soft touch. To put it bluntly, scores of German scientists and engineers were kidnapped and brought across the Channel under a program laughably referred to as enforced evacuation. The twisted cultural fabric present in Europe after World War II took some time to unravel, and was a process potholed with events and characters that don't fit into our nicely constructed idea of good and bad. The Nazis may have orchestrated a level of mass murder previously unheard of, but it soon became clear that present self-interest often trumped justice. The speed at which Western countries shifted their allegiance was shocking, but considering the fractured nature of the Cold War that followed, perhaps not entirely surprising. Let's be very clear, while the Nuremberg trials were groundbreaking in that they introduced the world to the word genocide and certainly held many high-ranking Nazis to account, in the grand scheme of things, they acted as little more than a symbol. Almost every country that fought the Nazis were more than happy to turn a blind eye when it suited them. The Ratlines acted as a lingering scab on the wounds of World War II and forced us to confront the fact that things weren't neatly tied up after May 1945, as history would rather tell us. The subsequent decades saw members of the Nazi Party living freely and openly in many areas of the world. Gradually, they were reeled in by some quite extraordinary work coming out of Israel. Slowly, one by one, Nazis have been brought to justice, but that number still remains low. We like to think that justice prevails, but as we've seen, it's just not always the case. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.